I almost survived No Nut November. That was until I saw my dead sister. I found the VHS tape on November 3rd while clearing out my sister Vanessa's apartment. The landlord had given me until the end of the month to remove her belongings, 3 months after she'd walked into Lake Superior and never walked out. The police recovered her body 4 days later, bloated and gray, her eyes open and staring at nothing. I identified her at the morgue, nodded when they asked if it was really her, then threw up in the parking lot for 20 minutes straight. The tape was inside a shoebox labeled Mom's Christmas Ornaments in the back of her closet, which made no sense because our mother had been dead for 8 years and Vanessa never celebrated holidays. The box contained no ornaments, just the tape in a clear plastic case with a label written in Vanessa's distinctive handwriting. Watch alone, November only, destroy after. 3 sentences that made my hands shake as I held the tape under the dim closet light. I should have thrown it away immediately. I should have listened to the voice in my head screaming that nothing good could come from watching whatever my dead sister had recorded. Instead, I slipped it into my backpack and continued packing her books. Vanessa had always been strange, but in the year before her death, strange had evolved into something darker and more concerning. She'd dropped out of her graduate program in anthropology without explanation, stopped returning calls, and moved into this dingy studio apartment on the wrong side of town. When I visited her in July, she'd lost 30 pounds, and her eyes had this hollow quality that made me think of abandoned houses. She talked about research she was doing, ancient practices that most academics dismissed as superstition, methods of preserving consciousness beyond death. I'd assumed she was having a breakdown, suggested therapy, offered to help her get back on her feet. She'd smiled at me with cracked lips and said some knowledge was worth dying for. I finished packing her apartment by nightfall, loading boxes into my truck while November wind cut through my jacket. The tape sat in my backpack like a stone, heavy with implications I didn't want to consider. My apartment was 20 minutes away, small and cluttered with the debris of my own failing life. At 26, I was working a dead-end job at a warehouse, living paycheck to paycheck, and using internet porn as a coping mechanism for everything I couldn't fix. No Nut November had seemed like a stupid challenge when my friend Derek suggested it on Halloween, but I'd committed anyway, desperate for any kind of structure or self-control in my life. 3 days into the challenge, and I was already struggling. My body and mind locked in constant warfare over urges I'd been indulging multiple times daily for the past decade. But finding Vanessa's tape had shifted something in my brain, redirected my obsessive thoughts away from sexual frustration and toward the mystery of what my sister had recorded before drowning herself. I waited until midnight to watch it, some superstitious part of me insisting that whatever was on the tape demanded darkness and solitude. My VHS player was ancient, salvaged from my parents' house after Dad moved to Arizona following Mom's funeral. I'd kept it for nostalgic reasons, never imagining I'd actually need it. The machine whirred and clicked as I inserted the tape, static filling my television screen before resolving into an image of Vanessa sitting in what looked like a basement. She wore a black dress I'd never seen before, her hair longer than I remembered, her face gaunt and serious. The timestamp in the corner read October 15th of this year, less than a month before she died. Her voice when she spoke was calm and measured, completely at odds with the manic energy she'd displayed during our last conversation. She explained that if I was watching this tape, it meant she had failed in her primary objective and succeeded in her contingency plan. She'd spent the last year studying resurrection practices from various cultures, focusing specifically on methods that required blood sacrifice and willing participation from male family members. The words came out of her mouth like she was discussing grocery shopping, clinical and detached, while my stomach churned with growing horror. Vanessa said she'd found something real, something that worked, buried in the archives of a deceased professor whose research had been deliberately suppressed by the university. The method required specific conditions to be met, including the subject's death occurring in water during a waning moon, their body being recovered and properly buried, and a male blood relative performing a summoning ritual during the month of November while maintaining complete sexual abstinence. She looked directly into the camera when she said that last part, her eyes boring into mine across time and death, and I felt ice crystallize in my chest. She continued talking, explaining that she'd left detailed instructions and all necessary materials in a location I'd remember from childhood, our family's old hunting cabin, 3 hours north near the Canadian border, where Dad used to take us before Mom got sick. Vanessa said, if I wanted to see her again, if I wanted to understand why she'd done this, I needed to complete the ritual before November ended. She said she loved me, that she'd always loved me more than was probably appropriate for a sister, and that what she was asking me to do was born from that love and from a desperate need to prove her research had value. The tape ended with her standing up and walking toward the camera, her hand reaching out to switch it off, but not before I caught a glimpse of something written on her palm in what looked like dried blood. Symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The screen went to static, and I sat frozen on my couch, my mind refusing to process what I'd just witnessed. My sister had deliberately drowned herself as part of some insane resurrection experiment, and she'd planned the whole thing around my participation in a joke internet challenge that I'd only committed to 3 days ago. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, trying to convince myself that Vanessa had been mentally ill, that the tape was the product of a diseased mind, that I should destroy it and forget I'd ever found it. But I kept thinking about how calm she'd seemed, how detailed her planning had been, how she'd known I'd be doing No Nut November before I'd even decided to try it myself. That last part especially bothered me, because I'd made the decision impulsively at Derek's Halloween party, weeks after Vanessa had recorded the tape. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to at least check the cabin. Not to complete any ritual, but to understand what Vanessa had been thinking, to find closure or evidence or something that would make her death make sense. I called in sick to work, threw camping gear and supplies into my truck, and started driving north as gray November light spread across the highway. The tape sat in my passenger seat, occasionally drawing my eyes away from the road, a physical reminder of my dead sister's impossible request. The drive took 4 hours because of road construction and early snow flurries that made the highway treacherous. I hadn't been to the cabin in 12 years, not since Mom's cancer got bad and Dad stopped pretending our family vacations meant anything. The place belonged to Dad's brother technically, but Uncle Raymond had moved to Florida decades ago and stopped paying property taxes until the county seized it. Dad had bought it back 5 years ago during a brief period of sobriety, then forgot about it when he remarried and moved west. The cabin looked worse than I remembered, paint peeling from wooden walls, the porch sagging under accumulated rot, windows dark and uninviting. Dead leaves covered the ground in thick drifts, and the surrounding pine forest pressed close like it was trying to reclaim the structure. I parked my truck and sat for 10 minutes, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing here, before finally forcing myself to get out and approach the front door. The key was where Vanessa said it would be, under the third stone from the left on the old fire pit. The lock was stiff but functional, and the door swung open with a horror movie creak that would have been funny under different circumstances. Inside, the cabin smelled like mildew and old wood, furniture covered in white sheets that glowed ghostly in the dim light filtering through dirty windows. Everything looked exactly as I remembered from childhood, frozen in time like a museum exhibit of our family's better days. I found Vanessa's materials in the basement, accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor that I'd forgotten existed. The basement was dirt-floored and cramped, lit by a single bare bulb that flickered when I pulled the chain. She'd set up what could only be described as an altar against the far wall, a wooden table covered in black cloth and surrounded by candles. On the table sat a leather journal, a ceremonial knife with strange engravings on the blade, several small bottles of liquid I didn't want to identify, and a necklace made of bone and silver that looked ancient and wrong. The journal was filled with Vanessa's handwriting, pages and pages of research notes, ritual instructions, and personal reflections that painted a picture of someone descending into obsessive madness. She wrote about our mother's death, about how she'd been haunted by it, driven to prove that consciousness persisted beyond physical death. She'd found the professor's research buried in university archives, documents describing successful resurrection rituals performed throughout history, always requiring specific conditions and always demanding a sacrifice of innocence or purity from the summoner. That's when I understood why she'd specified No Nut November. The ritual required the summoner to maintain complete sexual abstinence for at least 7 days before attempting it, building up what the journal called vital essence that would provide the energy needed to pull the deceased's consciousness back into physical form. Vanessa had timed everything perfectly, knowing I'd be clearing out her apartment in early November, knowing I'd find the tape, knowing I'd be doing the challenge because she'd somehow predicted it or manipulated me into it or I don't know what. I spent 2 hours reading her journal, and with each page, my skepticism battled against a growing sense of possibility. Vanessa included documentation, photographs of historical sites where successful rituals had allegedly occurred, testimonials from people who claimed to have brought back the dead. It all seemed insane, but it was meticulously researched and presented with the kind of academic rigor that Vanessa had always excelled at. She'd been brilliant before this consumed her, graduating top of her class, publishing papers that got noticed by actual scholars. This wasn't the work of a random crazy person. This was the work of a brilliant mind that had found something it believed was real. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple, according to the instructions. I needed to wait until the 10th night of November, ensure I'd maintained complete abstinence for the full duration, then follow a series of steps involving the ceremonial objects on the altar, light the candles in a specific order, recite words from a language I couldn't identify, cut my palm with the knife, and let blood drip onto the necklace while calling Vanessa's name. The journal warned that the ritual would demand everything from me, that I'd feel sensations and see things that would terrify me, but that I had to maintain focus and commitment or the result would be incomplete or corrupted. I left the cabin that first day without touching anything beyond the journal, which I took with me despite knowing I shouldn't. Back in my apartment, I tried to return to normal life, but normal felt impossible now. I went to work and moved boxes, came home and ate frozen dinners, but my mind was always in that basement, always circling around the question of whether any of this could possibly be real. Derek noticed my distraction and asked if I was okay, and I laughed and blamed it on the No Nut November challenge, said I was just horny and irritable like everyone else doing it. But the truth was, The sexual frustration had become background noise compared to my obsession with Vanessa's ritual. I researched everything I could find online about resurrection practices, ancient cultures that believed in bringing back the dead, academic papers that discussed consciousness and the possibility of existence beyond death. Most of it was clearly nonsense. But buried in the noise were occasional references to things that matched what Vanessa had written, practices that showed up across multiple unconnected cultures with eerily similar requirements. November 10th arrived faster than I wanted and slower than I could stand. I'd maintained the abstinence despite several close calls, my body screaming at me constantly while I fought against urges that felt physically painful after a week of denial. But something had shifted in my motivation. I wasn't doing this for a stupid internet challenge anymore. I was doing it because some insane part of me had started believing that maybe, possibly, Vanessa had found something real. I drove back to the cabin on November 10th, carrying a backpack full of supplies and a head full of doubts. The temperature had dropped significantly, and snow was falling in thick flakes that covered the highway and made driving treacherous. I almost turned back 3 times, almost convinced myself this was suicide or insanity or both. But each time I slowed down, I'd think about Vanessa's face in that video, about how calm and certain she'd been, and I'd keep driving north. The cabin was dark when I arrived, just after sunset, and I had to use my phone's flashlight to navigate the path to the front door. Inside, I set up camp in the living room, building a fire in the old stone fireplace with wood I found stacked against the exterior wall. The flames pushed back the darkness, but made the shadows dance in ways that looked too much like human figures, and I kept jumping at movements in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I waited until midnight to go down to the basement, some instinct telling me the ritual needed the deepest part of night to work. The altar looked exactly as I'd left it days earlier, candles waiting to be lit, knife gleaming in the dim light, necklace coiled like a sleeping serpent. I followed Vanessa's instructions exactly, lighting candles in the order she'd specified, from east to west in a spiral pattern that made my eyes hurt to track. The words I had to recite were phonetic approximations written in her journal, and they felt wrong in my mouth, syllables that didn't belong to any language I'd ever heard. As I spoke them, the temperature in the basement dropped noticeably, my breath becoming visible in clouds of vapor. The candle flames bent toward me despite no breeze, and shadows gathered in corners that shouldn't have been deep enough to hold them. I picked up the ceremonial knife with shaking hands, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. This was the point of no return. The moment when I'd either prove Vanessa had been crazy or prove that impossible things were real. I pressed the blade against my palm and drew it across in one quick motion, feeling the sharp sting followed by warm blood welling up. I held my hand over the bone necklace and let drops fall onto it while speaking Vanessa's name over and over, my voice getting louder and more desperate. The blood soaked into the bone like it was absorbing into a sponge, and the necklace began to glow with a sickly green light that shouldn't have been possible. The candle flames shot up toward the ceiling, and I heard something like wind rushing through the basement despite being underground. The temperature dropped so low I could see ice forming on the dirt floor, and then the candles all went out simultaneously, plunging me into absolute darkness. I stood frozen, holding the glowing necklace, feeling my heart trying to break through my ribs. Something moved in the darkness ahead of me, footsteps on the dirt floor, getting closer. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. Wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me, and I felt breath on my face that smelled like lake water and decay. Then Vanessa spoke, her voice exactly as I remembered, but with an echo underneath it, like multiple people talking at once. She said my name, said she knew I'd come, said she was so proud I'd completed the ritual. I felt hands touch my face, cold and wet, fingers tracing my jaw and cheeks like she was confirming I was real. The necklace's glow intensified, and in the green light I could finally see her. She looked like Vanessa but wrong, her skin too pale, her eyes too dark, her smile too wide. She wore the same black dress from the video, but it hung on her frame differently, like her body had been rearranged slightly wrong when it came back. Water dripped from her hair and dress, pooling at her feet, and I could see through her in certain angles, like she wasn't entirely solid yet. She told me the ritual wasn't complete, that bringing her fully back required one more step. She needed my vital essence, the energy I'd been building through abstinence, and she needed it transferred directly. Her hands moved down my face to my chest, and I felt a warmth spreading through me that fought against the cold of the basement. She explained that this was why the ritual required a male blood relative, why the sexual abstinence was necessary, why everything had to happen in November under specific lunar conditions. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body wasn't listening anymore. Vanessa's touch sent pulses of sensation through me that felt like electricity and desire mixed together, and I realized with horror that I was responding physically despite the wrongness of everything happening. She pressed against me, her wet dress soaking through my clothes, her lips against my ear, whispering words I didn't understand, but that made my body react in ways I couldn't control. She guided me down to the dirt floor, and I felt the necklace being placed around my neck, the bone cold against my skin. Her hands worked at my clothes, and I tried to protest, but my voice came out as a moan instead of words. The rational part of my brain had shut down completely, overwhelmed by sensation and horror, and a drugged feeling that made everything seem both real and dreamlike simultaneously. What happened next, I can't fully describe, because my memory fragments into disconnected images and sensations. Vanessa's body above me, her skin getting more solid and warm with each passing moment, the feeling of being drained, energy flowing out of me and into her like I was a battery being depleted. The sound of her voice, sometimes normal and sometimes that disturbing echo, chanting in the same language from the ritual. The basement filled with green light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, and shadows that moved with purpose around the edges of my vision. I don't know how long it lasted. Time felt broken, stretching and compressing randomly, but eventually, Vanessa's body went rigid above me, her back arching, and she screamed, a sound that was triumph and agony mixed together. The green light exploded outward, momentarily blinding me, and I felt the necklace around my neck burning like it was made of hot metal. Then everything went dark and silent, and I lost consciousness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Duluth. A hiker had found me unconscious in the woods half a mile from the cabin, suffering from severe hypothermia and malnutrition. My palm had a deep cut that had gotten infected, and I had what doctors described as unusual burn marks on my chest in a pattern they couldn't explain. The necklace was gone, and so was any evidence of what had happened in that basement. The police questioned me about what I'd been doing at the abandoned cabin, and I told them I'd gone there to feel close to my dead sister, that I'd been drinking, and must have wandered into the woods and passed out. They seemed satisfied with this explanation, chalking it up to grief and stupidity. My truck was still parked at the cabin, and when they brought me back to collect it, I checked the basement. The altar was gone, the candles were gone, everything was gone, except for dirt floor and empty space. But the burn marks on my chest remained, and they formed a pattern I recognized from Vanessa's research. Symbols that matched the ones she'd drawn on her palm in the video, permanent reminders of what I'd done. The doctors wanted to know how I'd gotten burned, and I told them I didn't remember, that everything after arriving at the cabin was a blank. They discussed possible head trauma, drugging, exposure-induced hallucinations, but they couldn't find any physical evidence to support those theories. I returned to my normal life, or tried to, back to the warehouse job, back to my apartment, back to pretending everything was fine. But I kept seeing Vanessa everywhere, in crowds on the street, in cars passing by, in reflections in store windows, always watching, always smiling that too wide smile. I told myself it was trauma, that I was processing grief and guilt, that my brain had cracked under the weight of what I'd experienced. Then, 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital, she showed up at my apartment. I opened the door thinking it was a food delivery, and there she stood, looking completely normal and alive. No translucent skin, no wrong proportions, just Vanessa as she'd been before everything went crazy. She was wearing regular clothes, jeans, and a sweater, her hair cut short in a style she'd never worn in life. She smiled at me, genuinely, and asked if she could come in. I let her in because I didn't know what else to do. She sat on my couch and explained what had happened, speaking calmly like we were discussing vacation plans. The ritual had worked, but not quite the way she'd expected. She'd come back, but she wasn't entirely human anymore. She needed to feed regularly, consuming the same vital essence she'd taken from me, but she could get it from anyone now, not just family. She'd been practicing, learning to blend in, figuring out how to exist in a world that thought she was dead. She thanked me for completing the ritual, said she knew how difficult it must have been, how wrong it must have felt. She apologized for manipulating me, for not being fully honest in the video about what the final step would require, but she wasn't sorry for doing it, for coming back, for proving her research had been correct. She'd discovered something profound, she said, a way to beat death itself, and wasn't that worth any price? I asked her what she wanted from me now, and she said nothing. She just wanted me to know she was okay, that I shouldn't feel guilty about what happened, that she'd made her choice and I'd made mine and everything had worked out. She stood to leave, and at the door, she turned back and told me one more thing. The burn marks on my chest were permanent, a connection between us that couldn't be broken. She'd always be able to find me, she said, and if I ever needed her, all I had to do was touch the scars and call her name. Then she left, and I stood in my apartment doorway, watching her walk down the hallway and disappear around the corner. I closed the door and locked it, and stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. She was alive, or something like alive, walking around in the world, because I'd performed an insane ritual that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. I've tried to move on, tried to pretend that night in the cabin didn't happen. I deleted all of Vanessa's research from my computer, destroyed her journal, and threw away anything that reminded me of what we'd done. But the scars on my chest remain, raised and dark against my skin, forming patterns I see in my nightmares. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I feel them burning, and I know Vanessa is somewhere out there, feeding on someone else, growing stronger, becoming something that was never meant to exist. No Nut November ended on schedule, and I didn't even notice when it was over. The challenge that had seemed so important became meaningless after what happened. I'd maintained abstinence for exactly the required duration, and in doing so, I'd brought my dead sister back to life in a form that was both her and not her. Human and not human. I'd proven that impossible things were real, and that knowledge sits in my chest like a stone, heavy and permanent. Derek still jokes about the challenge sometimes, asks if I made it through, and I tell him yes. I survived all 30 days. He doesn't know the cost of that survival, doesn't know what I fed to my sister in that basement, doesn't know that she's out there somewhere, wearing someone else's face, consuming someone else's essence. He thinks my distant behavior is just depression from losing Vanessa, and I let him believe that because the truth is so much worse. 6 months later, I saw her again, standing outside the warehouse where I work. She looked different, older somehow, more confident, and she was with someone, a man around our age who looked at her with obvious adoration. She caught my eye across the parking lot and smiled, raising her hand to wave. The man followed her gesture, saw me watching, and waved too. They looked like a normal couple, happy and alive, and if I didn't know better, I'd think they were just strangers I'd never met. But I touched the scars on my chest, through my shirt, felt them burning under my fingers, and knew exactly what Vanessa was doing with that man. She was feeding, taking from him what she'd taken from me, building her strength one victim at a time. And there was nothing I could do to stop her, because I'd been the one to bring her back, the one to complete the ritual, the one who'd chosen belief over sanity that night in November. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.